Thank you for joining us for Working Through the Word, a ministry of the Richmond Church of Christ.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome once again. Today we are going to talk about self-control. And I want to begin by thanking Robert for choosing the songs that he did. I don't know that I could have picked a better song than Let the Beauty of Jesus Be Seen in Me when talking about self-control. And so as a minister, that always helps when the song leader leads songs to prepare our minds. And I wanted to thank Robert for that. The reason this sermon came about was Mike told me that he wanted me to teach for him, and so I asked what lesson, and he said self-control, and I said okay. And then I realized that I couldn't cover everything I wanted to in the Bible study, so the sermon is also about self-control. And there's a little redundancy, but not much. The idea of self-control is best articulated, I believe, in the scripture that Brett read this morning. From Proverbs, a person without self-control is as defenseless as a city with broken down walls. If you think in terms of the Old Testament times when Solomon was writing and the importance of those walls that guarded the city, and whenever those walls were broken down, they were overrun, and the enemy took over and pillaged and plundered and took over that city. When we think of our own lives and our own minds, self-control is like that wall. If that wall goes down, then the devil comes in. And I believe that Solomon articulated that in a wonderful example. Peter commands us to add self-control to our faith. In 2 Peter 1, verses 5 through 7, for this very reason, make every effort to supplement your faith with virtue, and virtue with knowledge, and knowledge with self-control, and self-control with steadfastness, and steadfastness with godliness, and godliness with brotherly affection, and brotherly affection with love. In class this morning, we talked about how that's a process where you blend all these attributes together. And through blending these attributes together, we can live a life that's a godly life, and our reactions will be godly reactions. But to have self-control, that's not something that is innate. We have to work on that throughout our lives. I was thinking down there when I was waiting to come up, when I was 25, I thought by the time I got 55 that the challenges that I had living would be so much easier. Because you know, when you're 15, you think the 50, and 25, you think the 55 and the 65-year-olds all got it figured out, and they got self-control, and they don't have to worry about all these things. Well, I'm 57, I think, and I still have self-control issues. And I believe all of us have self-control issues. And so for us to maintain self-control, we have to have discipline. In 1 Corinthians 9, 24 through 27, Paul writes, do you know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. Now, when we were here in the 2010s and earlier, some point during that process, Natalie posted a picture of me running cross country on Facebook. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I imagine that some of you have seen that picture, because if you were friends with Natalie on Facebook, every time my birthday came about, this picture came about. I was a junior in high school, I believe. I was 6'2", 165 pounds. I am no longer 6'2", nor 165 pounds. And the way that I kept that shape, and then I went in the Army and kept a similar shape, but about 50 pounds heavier, was that they made me run. I never enjoyed running, and once I got out of the Army and quit taking PT tests, I quit running, as you can tell. But the way that I was able to maintain that athleticism, that physique, that will to do that thing was through discipline. And discipline leads to self-control. And as we go through our lives, we have to discipline ourselves to continue to maintain that self-control. In 1 Corinthians 6, verses 12 and 13, we read about one of the biggest challenges that I think many of us face, and that's self-control over the flesh. Paul writes, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. Food is meant for the stomach and the stomach for food, and God will destroy both one and the other. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. Many of the temptations that we face where we have to utilize self-control involve our bodies and our flesh. And as Christians, we have to be disciplined to avoid sinful temptation. We're going to talk about in a few minutes some practical strategies about how to use self-control to avoid these kinds of problems. But one of the ways is to avoid those temptations. Use self-control to not put yourself in a situation where you're going to sin. Because if we cannot stop the sin, it has control over us. All of you know someone whose fleshly sins have ruined their lives in so many different ways. We all have that have happened in our own family, our friendship networks, whereas if they would have had self-control and utilized self-control, their lives would have been so much better because they gave in to the temptations of the flesh. One of those temptations is sexual impurity. In 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 3 through 5, we read, "For this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you abstain from sexual immorality, that each one of you know how to control his own body in holiness and honor, not in the passion of lust like the Gentiles who do not know God." As Christians, we face temptations of sexual immorality just like the rest of the world. But the difference between us and the difference in the world is that we can utilize self-control. We will utilize self-control. When Paul talks about sexual immorality, it's a really simple definition. In Dave's words, if you're married and it's not with your spouse, it's sexual immorality. If you're not married, if you are looking, touching, or engaging in any sexual way with someone whom you are not married to, it is sexual immorality. That is definitely not the definition that the world uses, but that's the definition that the Bible uses. And so when we as Christians face these challenges, we have to utilize our self-control. Marriage is the institution that was brought about by God. One of the reasons was that it allows us to fulfill those temptations. In 1 Corinthians 7, 5 through 9, "Do not deprive one another except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourself to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now as a concession, not a command, I say this, I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and to the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than burn with passion." Paul was a bachelor. Paul's life, his missionary work, would have made it very difficult for him to be the servant of God that he was if he had been married. And so Paul talks about his self-control issues as he's writing. But Paul faced those challenges, and he tells us that one of the greatest challenges we're going to face is self-control issues around sexual desires. To utilize self-control, we must control our minds because our actions start in our minds and our thoughts. In 2 Corinthians 10, 5 through 6, we read, "We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ, being ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete." In Proverbs 4:23, we read, "Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flows the springs of life." If we take every thought captive to obey Christ, then we can utilize self-control in a much better way. I know that many of you have seen the WWJD, and it's one of those things that we often are not happy that people use because they misuse it sometimes. But if we use what would Jesus do to guide our decisions, to guide our thoughts, then that will help us as we face these temptations. Because if you control your thoughts, your actions will follow your thoughts. And then in Matthew 5:27 through 31, it's not okay to think about it and not do it. So many times we justify our actions and we say, well, I thought about it, but I didn't do it. If you thought about it, it's wrong too. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away, for it's better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. I believe what we're being taught there is that if there is something in our life that is causing us to sin, we need to get that out of our life. If it's a job, if it's a person, if it's an activity that we enjoy and it's causing us to sin, then we need to get that out of our life. We sang this morning, "Purer in heart, O God." If we have a pure heart, then we will want to get those things out of our lives. Now, I'm going to change the tenor of the lesson a little bit now. I'm going to give you some advice from my life that I think will help you in yours. And you're probably not going to think that this is going to come from me, because what I'm going to give you is advice about using self-control in weight loss. You can look at me and you can see that I'm fleshy or chunky or fluffy or whatever words that you want to use to describe. But there have been times in my life when I needed to do something and I had to get below a certain weight to do that. The first time was in 1992. After Desert Storm, I got back and I was in the Army National Guard, and they told me I needed to go to a leadership school. And to go, before I would become a sergeant at E5, I had to have this leadership school. Well, at the time they told me this, I was like 235, and they said, you have to make your chart weight. Well, in 1992, I don't know what it is now because I quit looking at the chart, but in 1992, if you were 74 inches, you had to weigh 204. There was another guy that was also 72 inches, and he weighed about the same as I did, and we said, we're going to make this weight. And so in 3 months, I went from 235 to 204. I'll never forget, it was Camp Shelby. We walked in, I weighed 203. The other guy weighed 207. He went home, and I went to Ryan's because I had made that weight. And that is one example. The second example, there's three of these examples, but I'll only give you the one that's the most meaningful to me. To go to certain high adventure things with scouts, you have to get below a certain weight. And the reason is they don't want us to have a heart attack and then sue BSA. It's really not a thing about caring for you, I don't think. But in 2018, Will and I were going to go to Philmont. And Andrew was telling me last night that Phil's described Philmont to you. It's like the pinnacle of scouting. And we were going to go and do this 75 miles of backpacking. And at the time we decided we were going to go, it was 9 months out, I weighed 298. I had to get to 248. And so in 9 months, I did various things, and I got to 246. We were supposed to leave on a Saturday. I don't know if y'all remember 2018. I was in Memphis, and on a Friday or Thursday, I think it was a Thursday, and I got a call, and there were wildfires in New Mexico in 2018. And those wildfires burned down parts of Philmont. And so those of us that were scheduled to go immediately, they called and said, you're not going this year. Now remember, I had lost 50 pounds to go to this adventure. I was with a buddy of mine in Memphis. As soon as I got that phone call, I said, we're going to Texas de Brazil. And we went to the Brazilian steakhouse, and we ate and ate and ate and ate. Because I no longer, in my mind, I no longer needed to utilize that self-control. So the weight loss description that I would give you, the way it works best, is to invest $2,000 in something that if you don't make the weight, then you don't get that $2,000 back. That's the only way I've found that it works for me, and I think it would probably work for most people. Now, some of you are saying, well, like my doctor says, if you lose weight, then you'll live longer and you'll make far more money than $2,000. But I haven't paid that $2,000 yet, so I don't look at it that same way. So what can we learn about self-control from Dave's weight loss journey? The first thing that we can learn is that we must constantly measure our thoughts and actions. One of the times that I was on a weight loss journey, I was responsible for feeding the scouts on the way down to Florida. We did Dutch oven cooking. I was on a low-carb thing, so we cooked chicken and rice with all kinds of chicken soup and then vegetables and this great dessert. I cooked it all, and I ate one piece of chicken and walked out on the beach and looked at the beach while they ate because I knew I couldn't be around that food. I had to continually control my thoughts and actions. In Philippians 4:8, we're told, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. The way to control our thoughts is to think about these things. Whenever your mind is drifting into an area you know is a sinful place, think about these things. There's lots of ways that you can do that. Most of you have a smartphone. I imagine if you have a smartphone, you probably have some kind of Bible app on that smartphone. At any point during the day, you can get on that smartphone and read scriptures. It works for Facebook. It works for scriptures as well. You can keep a Bible with you. And whenever you're straying into that area, read the Bible. You can also listen to Bible lessons or spiritual music. A lot of times when I'm working and my mind is getting distracted, I'll go to YouTube and Google. I don't guess you Google in YouTube. I search in YouTube a cappella music. And there are some beautiful a cappella groups that sing, and you can listen to the words and it gets your mind in a different place. Singing does that for me, listening to that kind of music. Bible lessons can do the same thing. I also like to sing spiritual songs. Sometimes in my office, I am just busting out Amazing Grace. And people, I don't know what they do because I leave the doors closed, but I know that they notice because they've told me, we hear you singing in your office. Well, the reason I'm singing is trying to keep my mind in a good place. Fellowship with Christian brethren. Last night, our fit team met. There was 20 or so of us. We had a great time for 3 hours. At no time during that 3 hours was I tempted in ways that would have led me astray because I was with brethren, and it was a great experience for us. And I believe that if we spent more time around our Christian brethren, then we would have less temptation to sin. And finally, pray, pray, and pray. Matthew 6:13, Jesus says, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Pray that you're not led into temptation. And don't pray that you're not led in temptation as you're driving to that temptation. Pray that you're not led into temptation long before that situation happens. When I was in the military, we trained, and we had to put on chemical suits and masks probably 1,500 times. And I was never in a situation where nerve gas or sarin gas or any of those nasty things they described came about. But had I been, I know exactly what I would have done. I'd have pulled my mask case open, I'd have put my mask on, and then I'd have put my stuff on, because that's what I did for 1,500 times. If you train yourself how you're going to react in a situation, then that's the way you will react in that situation. And so as you're going into your life, pray not to be led into temptation, but pray also that God will help you remember what you're supposed to do and act on it. Another way that we can utilize self-control is we must control our emotions. Recently, I don't know how long ago, 2 or 3 years, there was a billboard outside of Starkville. And it said on the billboard, I used to lived to eat, now I eat to live. I'm still in the first category. And I really don't know how miserable a life would be if all you did was eat just enough to keep you alive. I find joy in eating, which is why I'm back to where, in my fleshy state, that I was not for many months, we'll say. Because I find joy in eating. And so when I engage in eating and I lose my self-control, it's because I'm feeling so good about eating. And if you can control your emotions, then you can control your actions. When I was a much younger person, and I see it very well in my two 20-ish kids, they have very short tempers. I had a very short temper when I was in my 20s. And it didn't take much to get me mad and angry and throwing stuff and kicking stuff. As I've gotten older, my temper is much longer. I realize that it just really isn't a good idea to do that. I've gotten more self-control in that I'm able to control my emotions. But there are other emotions that I have difficulty with. In Proverbs 16:32, whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. If we can control our anger, that will get us so far in life. If we can keep our feelings in check, including anger and resentment and self-pity, then we will have a better life. We will be better servants for God, because our emotions result from an improper focus on ourselves. If you are acting emotionally, you are thinking about you. If you act in controlling your emotions, you're thinking about others. Sure, it feels good to hit something when you're angry, but it does no good to hit something when you're angry. And then self-control means refusing to act on our emotions. All of you have dealt with people where you thought, well, I won't say that. Let me go back. I have dealt with people where I thought that person just would be better off if I hit them in the mouth. Because the emotional response is, I'm tired of listening to them. If I hit them in the mouth, that will stop this, and this will end much better. But self-control doesn't let me do that. I don't hit them in the mouth. And because I have this emotion of anger or frustration or whatever it is, if I can control that emotion, then things will end better. And we also must avoid those temptations that lead us to sin. Each person is tempted when he's lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. You know the situations that tempt you to sin. If I were to ask you to make a list, you could easily make a list. If you know that those situations tempt you to sin, then you shouldn't put yourself in those situations. I am never going to be gluttonous at a place where they serve only asparagus, broccoli, and cauliflower. It's just not going to happen. And so if I'm trying to avoid gluttony, that's a really good place to go. I'm not going to be gluttonous at places that only serve grilled, like fish. I'll eat meat, but I want it fried. But if I go to, I don't even know if Ryan's is still in existence, but if I go to Golden Corral or a Brazilian steakhouse, I know going in that I'm going to have to control my actions, and sometimes I just don't. And so if you know that that's a problem for you, don't put yourself in that situation. And finally, to avoid getting into trouble by not utilizing self-control, we must surrender to God's control. In 1 Corinthians 9:27, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. I told you, $2,000 makes Dave lose weight. The eternal reward that we have as Christians is far more than $2,000. And so when you're thinking about your own challenges and your own self-control, you've been paying in to that eternal reward since you were baptized. And every day you live, you're paying into that eternal reward. And so when you have this temptation, And you think, man, I'd really like to do that. But then you think, I've got this eternal reward that I've been paying into all this time. I'm not going to do that because I'm going to lose that eternal reward. That $2,000 made me lose weight. Had I not paid that in advance, I would not have lost the weight. I am a living example of what wouldn't happen if I don't pay $2,000 in advance. We as Christians should be living examples of what does happen when we pay our salvation in advance, when we are paying every day toward that eternal reward that we strive for, because self-control is a choice. If you are sinning as a result of your emotions or your lust or whatever it is, it's a choice that you are making, and you have the ability to choose not to do that. If you focus on that eternal reward, that'll make that choice much easier. Today, if you haven't been baptized, you have a choice. You have the ability to start paying on that eternal reward today. If you believe that Christ is the Son of God and are willing to confess that he is and be baptized for remission of sins, then you can have that eternal reward just like the rest of us. And as you get baptized and you start living that life, your temptations are not going to go away. But you will have a stronger stance against those temptations because you're working toward that eternal reward. And sometimes we that are baptized forget about that eternal reward in the moment or a series of moments. And we do things that we regret and we know are sinful, and we need the prayers of the church to help us in those situations. Whatever your need this morning, if you will, please come forward as we stand and sing.
We hope you enjoyed today's broadcast brought to you by the Richmond Church of Christ. We are located at 1500 Lancaster Road in Richmond, Kentucky. We meet on Sunday mornings for Bible class at 9 a.m., followed by our morning worship service held at 10 a.m. Our Sunday evening service is held at 6 p.m., and our midweek Bible study is held on Wednesday at 7 p.m. If you are in the area, we would love to have you as our honored guest. Thanks for listening.